Welcome, everyone, to the Long Library, Episode 3 on Eudaimonism and Non-Aggression, a project of the Center for Stateless Society. I'm your host, Corey Massimino, and I'm joined, as always, by Dr. Roderick Long. How are you doing today, Roderick?
Pretty good.
Glad to have you on for our next episode. Sorry there was a little of a gap between the second and third one, but we're back on track here, and hopefully we'll keep trucking along with these. This time I thought we could get into moral philosophy because we haven't really touched on that in the show yet, and obviously that's very central to a lot of your writings and your work. And I wasn't sure where to go, and I kind of remembered this piece, which we'll link below, and it's a blog post from about 10 years ago. The date should be on here.
Something like that. I think that
11 years ago.
Scrolling down.
11 years ago last week, April 30th, 2013. Wow. And I read it back then when it came out, and it was sort of, the context of this is interesting and important. I mean, there was kind of a cross blog intra-libertarian debate, I guess, if you will, about the non-aggression principle.
Mm-hmm.
And this was one of your few installments in that debate. Could you maybe contextualize that or tell us what you remember of that whole thing ensuing and what your thoughts on it were?
So Matt Swilinski really kicked it off. And although most of the debate happened on the Bleeding Heart Libertarians blog, his article actually appeared on, I think, libertarianism.org.
Yeah.
So Matt had an article called 6 Reasons Libertarians Should Reject the Non-Aggression Principle. The arguments were, first of all, if you interpret it strictly, then it seems to rule out things like any kind of incursion of one person on another person's body or property, which means even the slightest impingement. So things like it would prohibit all pollution, not just serious pollution. You could also borrow here an argument from David Friedman that I don't think Matt cited, which is, if I just shine a flashlight onto your property, or just if photons are bouncing off my body onto your property, is that a invasion? And if you say, yes, you make human life impossible, but if you say no, then it seems like you are open to moderating the principle by consequential considerations or something. Also, it rules out very small, mild interventions are huge benefits. It's not clear how it handles risk. Does imposing a risk of a rights violation on someone count as a rights violation, count as aggression? Because if you say no, then it seems like I can just play Russian roulette with you against your will. But then if you say yes, well, I mean, everything we do imposes a little bit of risk. And so, the principle doesn't give us any guidance as to how to avoid that. It presupposes a theory of property. He thinks that because it's about aggression against person and property, but if you you haven't settled what counts as someone's property, you don't know what counts as aggression, and it doesn't say anything about how to handle children's rights, because children seem to have a positive right. An infant needs to be fed, and it doesn't seem to make any sense to say, no, as long as I'm not aggressing against the kid, I can just let it starve, etc. So those are some of the worries that that Matt had, and then there are various arguments that went back and forth about the bad results of keeping the principle versus the bad results of dropping it, and whether you can tweak the principle to fix certain things. And Matt said, well, sure, libertarians are smart and ingenious, and they can come up with ways of tweaking the principle to make it work, maybe. But at some point, there are sort of diminishing returns from tweaking, and he compared it to the attempt to save the Ptolemaic theory of the solar system. Well, it wasn't a solar system for Ptolemy; it was a terrestrial system, a geocentric system with the sun going around the Earth. And in order to make that work, you had to add all these little epicycles. And if you had enough epicycles, you could kind of make it work. But at some point, you just think, maybe it's time for us to do paradigm and drop it. And and so he was in favor of dropping it in favor of some less robust principle. And so various people wrote things, and so then I gave my response, defending trying to come up with a way of defending the non-aggression principle in a way that would allow you to do it in a nuanced way and not
Yeah,
kind of ham-handed way that he's worried about.
yeah, and a number of people jumped in, and people I think agreeing with Matt, and then also people like you defending the non-aggression principle, but I don't think anyone defending it just to your liking, I guess.
Yeah. So there's
Um,
so
and
Kevin Ballier came in against it. Brian Kaplan came in for it. I think various folks. And again, and some of it was on the blog, and some of it was on uh, other places. Um,
yeah, I thought it was interesting. This is back on the Bleeding Heart Libertarians blog, and I feel like you were probably one of the few people on that blog to jump into the discussion to defend the non-aggression principle. That blog was so interesting, and it's kind of gone now. Could you tell our viewers maybe who weren't around for this debate, or who didn't kind of see the impact of this Bleeding Heart Libertarians blog, what this was about, and your involvement with it?
okay, so this blog, and although it's no longer active, it's all of it still exists online.
Yeah, it's all
Uh,
online.
it was founded primarily by Matt Zwolinski, and the the subtitle of Bleeding Heart Libertarians was Free Markets and Social Justice, and so it was a blog for people who shared a libertarian commitment to free markets, but also some kind of lefty commitment to some conception of social justice. Although this covered a wide variety of different flavors of libertarian and different flavors of social justice. So there was certainly not a lot of unanimity on the blog, but it was people who thought that there was some important way in which libertarianism and social justice concerns could, in some useful way, inform and be informed by uh, each other. And uh, a lot of people on the blog were doing some kind of a fusion of maybe like Rawls and Hayek, something like that. Although I don't think that describes everyone. Certainly doesn't describe me. Um, except a little bit. I mean, there's a little bit of Rawls, a little bit of Hayek, but not quite so much Rawls as some of the other people wanted. Um, anyway, it was a controversial but popular uh, blog, and
Yeah,
eventually Matt decided to shut it down for various reasons. But it's worth reading. There's lots of good stuff on there.
yeah, I really can't say enough how big this debate and the blog in general was to kind of my intellectual development, especially in the early and mid 2010s, as I stumbled upon the particular flavor of views that I still have now. Um, I strongly recommend everyone to go check it out if they haven't. There's tons of interesting debates on there about tons of issues related to political philosophy. And like you said, I really always enjoyed the variety there. Like for the header of Bleeding Heart Libertarians, still there was tons of internal disagreement. Like you said, I mean, there was you and I feel like Gary Chardier posted there a bit. The more Aristotelian views, and then you, like you said, you had like I guess Jason Brennan and John Tomasi as more Rawls Hayekian fusionists, and then you had like Steve Horowitz would blog here. Um, and he wasn't really either of those things, and yeah, um, really great stuff, and I miss it a lot.
Yeah, we had a lot of
Um,
people who weren't members of the blog, but who were still in his blog as guest bloggers.
that's true.
Uh,
I'm just looking at the list now, and Charles Johnson has some posts. Even Elizabeth Anderson and Deidre McCloskey. I mean, that's
yeah,
Eric Mack. Bill
Kevin
Steiner,
Carson, Jacob Levy. Um,
Peter Becky. Um, yeah, really good stuff. Sarah Squire as well, of course. So, I mean, I'm curious though, as the kind of when I look at that list, you are like the lone, maybe except for Gary, who had some posts, but you're like the. It feels like you're like the lone Aristotelian among that bunch. Did you ever feel like bullied by the anti Aristotelians or the anti Napsters at Bleeding Heart Libertarians? Did they
not
ever
really.
like shame you or bully you? Okay. Did they? I mean, they probably aggressed against you, maybe, since they don't
Oh,
believe
yeah.
in the nap.
But, it's hard to aggress against someone on a blog. I guess
Ah,
they
some
could
of
they could make a death threat against me, which would count as aggression by my lights. But they didn't.
yeah, yeah, and that was a regular occurrence. I'm sure. Looking back, I think on that these were intense debates, folks. Uh, so let's jump into the meat of the article here. Again, it's Eudaimonism and Non-Aggression, and we'll link it below, of course. Um, and it's part of a few posts, and you link to them within the piece too that were you contributed as part of that debate, and other
Yeah,
pieces
and
in New
there
York
were
and
some more
elsewhere.
that came after it as well.
Yeah, yeah, you can continue the discussion, and of course, strongly recommend to read the earlier installments, which Roderick described, like the one where Matt Zwolinski posted, which prompted it all, and some others along the way. Um, and this article even links to plenty of other pieces that I'll want to get into with you future episodes. A lot of them, I think. So I guess first, we haven't really touched on Aristotelianism and Eudaimonism on this show yet. Could you give our viewers and listeners just a brief explanation of what Eudaimonism is and what that means?
Okay, we see. I've got my Aristotelian cup here. This is Aristotle's four terrestrial elements: earth, water, air, and fire, done as a periodic table of elements, plus his one celestial one.
Oh,
Um,
amazing! I have
there's
an Albert Camus cup, so like not Aristotelian at all, but still philosophy cups.
where does the caption say on that one? The
It's the
struggle.
penultimate line of the myth of Sisyphus.
Oh yeah, yes. We must just imagine
Well,
Sisyphus happy.
it's the
Yeah,
line before that.
Aristotle and Camus might have different views about happiness. Um, well, anyway, so uh,
That could be an interesting episode.
yeah, how can we get them both to come on the podcast?
Yeah, I'll reach out to their people. Maybe.
Yeah, promise them coffee. Uh, Aristotle probably never had coffee. Poor guy.
Well, he
Uh,
certainly did not achieve eudaimonia then, out of his reach.
well, also the whole slavery thing. Uh,
Oh yeah, yeah,
uh, and,
that as well, I guess.
well, there were some ways in which he did not fully manifest virtue. All right, so uh, the Aristotelian idea, and sort of more broadly, this eudaimonist idea that comes from a number of ancient Greek philosophers. You find it in Socrates and Plato, and there's a sort of an oddball version of it in the Stoics. There is a version of it that gets picked up in the Middle Ages and gets fused with either Christianity or Judaism or Islam, depending on um, on the person's well, obviously their religious commitments. Um, uh, the word eudaimonia is often translated happiness. Um, Literally, it means having a favorable guardian spirit, a favorable daimon. That's the root of demon, although it didn't have that negative connotation at the time. But
Can we
by
just stop too before on? I'm actually really curious. Before you go ahead, the translation of the term is so interesting to me, and I feel like I see so much disagreement over how to translate that term.
yeah, and
And I also
I'm
see
about to talk about that. Um,
happiness, flourishing.
yeah, so the idea is yeah, so I mean the favorable guardian spirit reading was a dead metaphor by Aristotle's time, pretty much. Although Socrates may kind of have believed in one, but it's unclear. But they just put something like your life going well. Um, when people translate it as happiness nowadays, often that has the connotation for us of something like a feeling. Happiness is a feeling you can have. and it's a feeling that can come and go. You could be happy for 5 minutes, and then then unhappy for an hour, and then happy for a year, and then unhappy for another hour, and so on, depending on just how you're feeling. Uh, Whereas for Aristotle, at least, and for most of the people I'm calling these classical eudaimonists, uh, it meant something like an objective state of doing well, which ordinarily would, for most of these thinkers, would include good feelings. And if you feel lousy all the time, you're not doing so well. But it has to do with how your life is going objectively. Now, in fact, the Greek term was used pretty loosely, and a lot of Greeks would have used it and did use it to mean something like a pleasant feeling. In fact, at the beginning of his major ethical treatise, the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle runs through a bunch of different common conceptions of happiness. So he says of eudaimonia, and he says, well, there are people who think it's primarily a matter of pleasure. People think it's primarily a matter of wealth. People think it's primarily a matter of honor, by which he meant being honored. So your reputation, being admired and respected by your peers. There are people who think it's primarily a matter of virtue. People think it's primarily a matter of the contemplative life, et cetera, et cetera. And he runs through these various options uh, and tries to argue about which ones are wrong, which ones are partly right but not completely right. So the idea that eudaimonia is something more than just how you feel was not universal among the Greeks. There were a lot of people who thought it was something like pleasure. It's just like what counts for a successful life. Um, but Aristotle thinks he's got an argument against the view that it's just a feeling, which is this idea. Suppose someone were to offer you, he says, and this isn't at the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics, this is later on, I forget what book, but he says, suppose someone were to offer you uh, the following deal, they reduce your mentality to the level of an infant, but you could have lots and lots of pleasant feelings. You'd be one happy, gurgling infant, but you'd just be an infant. You wouldn't have any kind of higher knowledge or understanding, but you'd be perfectly satisfied from the inside. You wouldn't feel anything lacking. You'd get whatever infants want. You get your
Right.
rattle
I'll
and your
take it.
bottle and your diaper changed whenever you wanted, and so forth. You'd be as pleased as an infant can be. You wouldn't miss anything from your subjective perspective. But when you contemplate that option now, Aristotle thinks you wouldn't go for it. So he thinks that shows that happiness is more than a pleasant feeling. Now, John Stuart Mill would later sort of respond to that by saying, well, no, that kind of argument only shows that we care about what kinds of pleasure we have. And Mill has this theory of higher and lower pleasures, and that one doesn't satisfy us because it only has lower pleasures and not higher ones. But then you can see Robert Nozick as updating Aristotle's argument sort of to get around Mill with his experience machine. And so Nozick says, suppose that someone could plug you into a machine. They would give you all the experiences you want, higher pleasures, lower pleasures, whatever you want. But in reality, you wouldn't be achieving anything. You wouldn't even be choosing anything. Because people often think the experience machine is something like virtual reality, but it's more extreme than that. Because in virtual reality, your environment is simulated, but then you're making real choices in response to it. Whereas what Nozick is envisioning is that there's a certain way it feels to make certain choices, and that's just programmed into you. So you're not actually making any choices, you're just having the feeling of making them. So all these things are played for, and you can request whatever kind of life you want. But in real life, you're not achieving anything. You're just lying there, and all your friends are dying, or hate you, or whatever, and nothing that you care about objectively is actually happening. But but you're perfectly satisfied. So Nozick thinks people would not plug in. Now he may be over optimistic about that. At least when I present this case to my students, a lot of my students will say, "Yo, sign me up right now, plug me in." Um,
And so
uh,
you failed them.
No, I just give them the experience of failing. Uh, but
That's nicer.
uh, but at any rate, if you have any reluctance to plug in, at any rate, those things that shows that you care about something more than just how your experiences feel from the inside. You care about how your life actually goes. And there's another
Mhm.
argument that it's something. Some of this goes back to Bertrand Russell, maybe, who says, why do people buy life insurance? After all, you're not going to be around to get the pleasant result of seeing your loved ones taken care of. You could say, well, you get pleasure now from the thought that they will get taken care of. But then, suppose you could get that pleasant thought without actually getting life insurance. So some way
Mhm.
this is now Russell doesn't give this version of it, but later people sometimes say, look, suppose someone offered you the deal, you can either buy life insurance for a certain amount, or you can have a pill that'll make you believe you bought life insurance. The pill's cheaper. Why would you not take the pill if all you care about is how you feel? And you'll get that pleasant feeling of thinking that your loved ones are going to do well. And if that's not enough, you want them actually to do well. That suggests that your desires are objective. You care about how things actually go, and not just how they feel for you. So anyway, so broadly speaking, the Aristotelian side, and I think Platonic too, um, uh, takes the view that it matters to us. It should matter, and really, if we really think carefully about it, it does matter to us how our lives go, not just how they feel like they're going from the inside. And so that's how Aristotle interprets eudaimonia. Um, Now, of course, a further idea that but anyway, so sometimes people nowadays don't want to translate it as happiness on the grounds that happiness has the connotation of a subjective pleasure, and so they will suggest something like flourishing or something like that. But other people say, well, you know, happiness hasn't always meant, it was a subjective pleasure. It hasn't always had that connotation. It acquired that connotation because people just had bad philosophical views, and so they hold on to happiness. Um, the
I've also heard, and this one feels a little weird. Blessed. I guess that's going back to like how you point out kind of the original meaning. But what do you think of
Yeah,
that?
I mean, it does have a sort of religious flavor that not everyone wants it. Now, Aristotle does use a term that's often translated blessed. It's not his main term for happiness. It's this other term. Instead of talking about someone being eudaimon, he'll talk about someone being makarios, which literally means blessed. But he doesn't use it very often. Um, and you know, now there is a kind of religious dimension to happiness for Aristotle. It's rather different from the kind you get with like later religious thinkers and who are doing like Christian or Jewish or a Muslim thing with these ideas. But there is an aspect of that. He thinks that we are becoming that eudaimonia enables us to become as godlike as it's possible for a human being to be without transcending the human, um, and it somehow puts us in touch with the divine in a way that he's at least in the surviving works we have is very vague. Um, I've also, and this is a rather different set of connotations. I've seen some people argue that eudaimonia should be translated as success. Um, of course, there the connotation is sort of quite the other way. It's sort of you know it is the connotation is sort of very materialistic. We think of success often in terms of your career or wealth or power or status or something like that. Although, of course, it has a broader range of connotations. I have I have successfully completed this artwork or whatever. Um, but but anyway, the so uh, there is controversy about you know how
Yeah,
to
to me, blessed sounds weirdly, maybe I don't know, arbitrary. Like it's not even. It's just something bestowed upon you. It does nothing to do with your own actions. or thoughts.
Yeah, that might be a another
That's
concern about it, because
a
it's
weird.
one of the things that they divided a lot of these thinkers is, to what extent does eudaimonia depend on your own actions? To what extent does it depend on external circumstances? So the Stoics thought it depended entirely on your own actions, no dependence
Yeah,
on external circumstances at all. Aristotle thinks that's too extreme, but he didn't know about the Stoics; they came later. But Socrates sometimes says similar things, and Aristotle resists that. But he thinks it's on the right track. He thinks that happiness is the kind of thing that has to be mostly in our control, and also he thinks it has to be something that that is fairly robust. He says it can't be easily lost. So one way of thinking about it is, think about things like health. Like, could you be could you be healthy for 5 minutes? You could feel healthy for 5 minutes, and you could be sick, but then you've got, there's just 5 minutes when you're not feeling anything in particular, but you might think you're not really being healthy. Or could two countries that are at war be at peace for 5 minutes? You might think that's just not long enough. Even if they're not shooting at each other at the moment. Um, or could you be committed to someone or something? Or could you be in love with someone for 5 minutes? So you could feel all kinds of things for 5 minutes, but it's more robust than that. So there's this robustness requirement. There's also this requirement that it not be something that depends largely on other people's choices. That's one of the reasons he thinks that being honored, social status, can't be the whole deal or the central deal of well-being. He thinks it matters a bit. He thinks it matters more than Socrates does, but he thinks that because what other people think of you depends more on them than on you. Uh, if that were the centerpiece of happiness, then your happiness would be very fragile. Your happiness would be very chancy because it would depend mostly on other people. And that's kind of like, if you have a condition where you get sick more easily than other people do, then that's already a health problem if your health is too fragile. Now, of course, the Stoic equivalent for health would be, well, the very ability to get sick is a health problem, so everyone's sick. But again, Aristotle's going to say, no, that's excessive. We need terms like healthy and sick to distinguish different things. But he would say, as we do say, that if someone has a condition that makes them more likely than the average person to get sick, they already have a health problem. So likewise, if your happiness is especially vulnerable to bad luck, other people's choices, and so forth, if it's sort of easily lost, then your life is already going badly, even if you feel fine at the moment. Um, so so you're right that blessedness does sound as though it's something bestowed on you by a god, in a way that is mostly outside your control. Although, of course, that could depend on your details of what you think
yeah,
about how these things work. Um, anyway, so a further thing that these guys think, of course, is that, and nothing I've said so far, you could buy everything I've said so far of this conception of well-being, and yet balk at the next crucial bit, which is, I think that moral virtue, is part of this good life or success or blessedness or happiness or flourishing, or whatever you want to call it. That, and then it's not just a external means to it. It's not just a strategy like being virtuous to bring this about, but it's actually part of it. That no one counts as happy, successful, flourishing, whatever, unless they are behaving virtuously. Um, and uh, and they give different kinds of arguments for this. Uh, I think, although Aristotle isn't quite as explicit about this as I'd like, Aristotle seems to see virtue as something like, well, first of all, it's partly about having the right emotional response to various situations. But the standard that determines the right emotional response seems to be something to do with what is the most human way of living. So he thinks that that our humanness is kind of a central and essential feature of us. It's not just one of many things about us, but it's something like our essence. And so uh, we should, and so uh, you could see various ways of falling short of virtue as ways of either sliding down into the subhuman or mistakenly attempting the superhuman. So, for example, if you are uh, too susceptible to bodily pleasures, too easily tempted by them, then you're like an animal that just is ruled by its appetites, and you can't distance yourself from your appetites. Um, but on the other hand, if you're just completely insensible to them and you're not moved by them at all, then you're treating yourself like a disembodied uh, soul or God or something, which is not what we are. Um, and likewise with courage, if you're too fearful, you don't face challenges that are worth facing, then you're overvaluing your vulnerable embodiedness. You are treating that as paramount. But on the other hand, if you just you know rush forward, as he says, the Celts, he says, are not afraid of anything. Fire, earthquake, and so forth. If there's a forest fire, they'll go and attack it with their sword or something. Uh, he supposes. Um, Maybe this is why it's okay for Greeks to enslave them. Um, uh, but uh, anyway, they would be undervaluing their physical embodiedness, and he often thinks that various conceptions of happiness he thinks are mistaken, often seem to slide into the subhuman or superhuman variety. So the average Greek on the street, he thinks, tended to overvalue things like pleasure or wealth, power, or whatever, and they were sort of overvaluing their material security and well-being. And but he also tends to think that Socrates may have undervalued it, because Socrates thinks that nothing bad can happen to a good person. That if you could be, um,
Yeah.
and so Aristotle says, the people, anyone who says you could be happy when you're being tortured on the rack is just saying something that's we can't seriously uh, believe. Although the Stoics came along later on and they did seem to quite seriously believe it, but he would think they're making the mistake of treating ourselves as some kind of disembodied uh, superhumans. But he does tend to think one of these mistakes is worse than the other. That it's striving to be superhuman is not as bad a mistake as sliding into the subhuman, because although we are material embodied rational beings, our reason should rule our material embodiedness, and so therefore it's worse to overvalue the material embodied side than to overvalue the rational side. But still, they're both mistakes.
I'm
Um,
curious how that relates to this view that um, there's this golden mean between the sub and superhuman that we're striving for. Because earlier you also were mentioning Aristotle's views on how like religion um, interacts with eudaimonia, and that he also seems to think that eudaimonia is about progressing toward something
yeah, he has.
godlike.
There are these two lines he has in two different places that, at first glance, might seem to be contradictory. So, on the one
Uh-huh.
hand, when he's talking about whether, on the one hand, so there's a point when he's considering whether philosophical contemplation, how big a role should that play in happiness, and suddenly, and he considers the question like, should that be the whole deal? And on the one hand, he says, well, someone might say that this is too high a life for a human being. It's a godlike life. And Aristotle says, well, shouldn't we gratify the highest part of ourselves? And the highest part of ourselves is reason, which is divine. So we shouldn't listen to those who say you are human, live a human way, think human thoughts. Instead, we should try to divinize ourselves as far as possible. He says. But on the other hand, he also says, I'm talking about the same issue. He says, uh, well, the person who lives a life of philosophical contemplation, insofar as they are a human being, will also need to live a human and political life, and will also need the virtues appropriate to that. So, and I don't think it's a contradiction. I think he's just sort of saying, within the range. So when he talks about the golden mean, the golden mean is not just going right down the middle between two things. And so he thinks that within the human range, you should be as close to the divine side as possible. But we shouldn't try and leave the human range and go, over to uh, the divine side, because that's not possible or desirable. In fact, he says you shouldn't wish. At one point, he says you shouldn't wish for your friend to be transformed into a god, because neither your friend nor your friendship would survive the transition. Um, so stop wishing for your friends to be transformed into gods. I know you're constantly wishing.
Well, I'm curious what that means. I mean, especially in context of, say, something now we have these, transhumanist ideas.
Yeah.
And so because if the standard is humanness, then how from within that standard can we actually say I don't I don't want to be a mere like a non-rational animal or a super rational god?
Yeah, it's interesting to ask, to what extent is transhumanism, or what kinds of transhumanism perhaps are or are not consistent with what Aristotle is
Yeah.
saying? Because of course, when Aristotle is saying that we are essentially human, um, I think that uh, he's primarily interested in our being rational animals. Not necessarily in all the particular details of our biology. So,
Mm-hmm.
uh, so if some of those things could be altered, uh, I mean,
It would still be reason in charge of what's being altered and using it to
yeah,
serve reasoning ends.
but it is an interesting question, which he didn't, and it's not clear what he has in mind. When he talks about someone being transformed into a god, it's not clear what he has in mind. What are we
Yeah.
supposed to picture? Particularly since when he talks about gods, he didn't believe in the traditional Greek mythological gods, like Zeus and that lot. So his gods would have been completely immaterial. They would have been immaterial intellects with no bodies at all.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and not all transhumanists are aiming at that, although some of them might come close. Uh, but anyway, yeah. So when he talks about becoming a god, he doesn't mean becoming like Zeus. He means not having any kind of
Corporeal form,
yeah, just being
which
pure disembodied intellect. He thinks you shouldn't wish that for your friend. You shouldn't wish it for yourself.
well, so then why not why from within the standard of humanness should I prefer to be dissatisfied Socrates than a satisfied pig? Why can't I go the other way? Why shouldn't I if the standard is humanist, why not stop? How do I judge the something like stop, like if I stop being human? It doesn't, then I would just have a new standard, right?
Um, well, I mean, he's going to say, well, again, he's going to say that what is, well, first of all, he says that you wouldn't, one argument he gives is you wouldn't really want it, if you consider, if someone made you the offer of being reduced to an infant or to an animal or something, or to the mentality, even if you remain sort of biologically human, uh, you wouldn't accept it. And you might say, well, don't some people, people who get addicted to various certain kinds of drugs might just sort of just completely, but of course he's not talking about someone who tries some drug and then gets addicted to it. He's talking about someone who clear-eyedly chooses ahead of time, okay, I'm going to get addicted to this drug. I'm going to and I want to become such that all I ever care about is the drug. Most drug addicts don't come to it that way, and he thinks that most people would not choose that. And he thinks, but he doesn't think it's just happenstance that they wouldn't. He thinks that being human, there's something noble about our ability to rise above our appetites and resist them. Uh, there's something attractive and appealing about that, which animals don't have. They have their own advantages, but we have that, and having it, a life a life where we don't make use of it and don't exercise it, don't somehow is missing out on some vital bit of important value.
Let's connect the discussion more to ethics, I think, because the name of the piece is Eudaimonism and Non-Aggression. Non-aggression is an ethical issue, and I think maybe for some people, at least operating from certain ethical viewpoints, it's not apparent how the conversation we've been having relates to ethics of
Mm-hmm.
right and wrong, maybe. So, and you did get on virtue a little bit, but maybe going back to that as well. I mean, what is the discussion of what does it mean to live a happy life, a successful life, a flourishing life, have to do with what we traditionally consider are ethical questions of right and
Okay.
wrong?
All right. So first of all, I think that for questions of non-aggression, the virtue that's most relevant is justice. But how it relates to the other virtues is going to be important too. But let me first say something about justice. So Aristotle is not a libertarian. Aristotle himself does not accept the non-aggression principle. He does accept ideas that I think can plausibly be developed in that direction. Um, he thinks that, and a lot of the Greeks thought this is a very common Greek view, that one of the differences between human beings and animals is that human beings can settle their differences through rational discussion. And there's a famous funeral oration by a Greek orator named Lysias, who says, you know, our ancestors who devised our political, I think he was Athenians. He was talking about sort of the Athenian democracy. Uh, our institutions thought that it was the way of animals to resolve disputes by violence, and the way of human beings to resolve them through rational discussion because we're rational beings. Um, so this is an argument in favor of democracy, uh, or at least some kind of you know republican with a small r of institutions. Because Aristotle wasn't a pure Democrat, but he was certainly more so than Plato. But you can also treat this just in terms of sort of interpersonal interaction. There's something more human about dealing with other people through reason rather than through force. We have this ability to engage other people as conversation partners that animals don't have in the same way or to the same extent, although there are sort of interesting ways in which animals are not completely excluded from that. That may not have been on Aristotle's radar because he did not have radar. Um, but we know more about communication among animals now than he did, even though he did spend a lot of his time studying animals. Uh, but um, but anyway, there is this distinctive you know conversation. The word logos can mean both reason and speech, and the Greeks had thought there was a very close connection between them, and that you know, we are speaking animals, rational animals. So from it's not that far a leap from the idea of seeing other people as conversation partners rather than objects of prey or manipulation to something like a non-aggression principle. But then comes the next idea, which is the idea that I use specifically in this article in replying primarily to Matt, which is the idea of the unity of virtue. Um, Now, the unity of virtue uh, was defended by Socrates in a strong form, where he held that all the different virtues, or he seems to have held, that all the different virtues are really just different names for the one and the same virtue. So there's just this one thing, wisdom, which is a kind of general understanding of human life and what's valuable in life. And we call it courage when it's involved in facing danger, and we call it generosity when it's concerned with details about helping other people and so forth. But it's really just one state. Aristotle does not have. Uh, uh, Aristotle is a weaker version of the view because his view is that you can't have any one virtue completely without having them all, but you can have one to a greater extent than another. So you can be highly courageous but not very just, or highly just but not very generous, or whatever. So they're not just different names for the same state. But he thinks that nevertheless you can't have one fully without the other because their content overlaps. So here's an example I like to use. Suppose that I borrow something from you, and I'm on my way to your place to return it when a mugger comes up to me and demands everything I'm carrying, including this thing that's yours. Well, so two different virtues become relevant here. So there's a virtue of justice, which can say I should return your stuff because I promised to, or it's yours, or whatever. And then there's a virtue of courage, which does not say for Aristotle you should face every and all danger no matter what. You should face dangers that's reasonable to face, and not ones that's not reasonable to face. You shouldn't be like a Celt. Um, but this is a case where you can't fully settle what justice requires of you independently of what courage requires of you, or vice versa. Um, in order to know whether this is a risk worth taking, because courage is about facing risks worth taking. And in order to know whether this is a risk worth taking, you have to take justice into account. But on the other hand, what does justice require of you? Does justice require of me that I sacrifice my life in order to return, a uh, you know, your pencil case to you or something? Um, you can't you can't fully settle what justice requires of you without invoking what risks are worth taking. And so there's a kind of mutual adjustment. Uh, we can't fully settle one of those without the other. Hi, kitty. Um, and which one is that?
This is a subhuman. This is a subhuman. This is
Oh
Matt.
no! Oh no! There's no comments to add.
MAU. MAU.
Urgh, arg. Um. Me
That was a
want.
cat for the listeners on my screen.
Oh, that's right. If some people only listening, not watching, they don't
Yeah, they
know
won't know what we're talking about.
that. Yes, there was a cat that walked across the screen on Corey's end, not mine. I do not have a cat at present, as far as I know. Um. Uh. And uh, if you are, you if you are, sufficiently attracted by, um, sufficiently tempted by material pleasures, and you can't be counted on to do the just thing when when you're tempted away by something pleasant, or if you're unusually fearful, you can't be counted to do the just thing. Anyway, so you can't. Uh, Even though you could be mostly one of them and not mostly another, you can't be reliably any one of them without all of them. And so the idea is, as I see it, that the content of justice is sort of mutually reciprocally determining. That you can't fully settle the content of any one of the virtues except by kind of reflective equilibration with the others. So see, I'm using a term from Rawls. Hi, Rawls. I let in just a little bit in. So now where this becomes relevant to the non-aggression principle is some of the virtues are, they have a strong sort of deontological, rule-based flavor to them. They're not particularly about producing beneficial consequences. They're primarily following rules. This is true for um, for Aristotle too, even though his conception of justice is not the non-aggression principle. His conception of justice looks very different from the other virtues. It's all this, it looks much more rule-oriented. And a number of people have noticed that in the sort of the virtue tradition. Adam Smith, for example, says that the difference between justice and the other virtues is that justice is like the rules of grammar. They're fairly precise and simple and easy to learn. And the other virtues are kind of like the rules of style. So he says, if I owe you $10, it's easy to answer how much I should give you. $10. 9 is not enough. 11 is not being extra just. It might be generous, but it's not extra just. But if I have to be generous toward you, it's much vaguer of how much I should give you. It's much more of something you get through a kind of feeling for the situation you develop through experience. And that's sort of a very Aristotelian idea. David Hume says the same thing, so David Hume draws the conclusion that the fact that justice is so much more precise than the other virtues is a sign that justice is a product of human convention in a way that the other virtues aren't. But Smith, who was influenced by Hume, Smith didn't follow him on that point. Smith says, nah, it's just that they're different this way. Anyway, so justice is, fairly deontic type of virtue, but then there are virtues like benevolence, which are primarily about producing beneficial consequences for other people, or virtues like prudence, which are primarily about producing beneficial consequences for yourself. And if those are all in reciprocal determination with, if virtues that are primarily consequence oriented are in reciprocal determination with virtues that are more deontic, then on the one hand, that means there's going to be some consequentialist influence on determining the precise boundaries of the deontic virtues. But it's going to go the other way too, that what counts as a good consequence will be influenced by considerations of justice. So the way is, you could have to say that each of these virtues has some kind of a prima facie content, but that as you engage in this reciprocal determination, you are making them more specific, so that consequential considerations will shape exactly what the non-aggression principle means in particular cases. And so things like it'll shape questions, if you can bring consequential considerations in to shape questions like, is your breathing in the same room that I'm in count as aggression? And, we have good consequential reasons for thinking no. Unless you have bubonic plague, and then maybe yes. But on the other hand, it doesn't mean that consequences are just overriding the non-aggression, because it goes the other way too. Um, our idea of what counts as a good consequence is going to be influenced by these considerations of justice, and and so this was the sort of the nuanced version of non-aggression principle. So here's an example. I don't talk about this example in this particular article, but it comes up in one of the. I don't think I do, but it comes up in one of the articles in that came out in this debate. Is so the question is, suppose that I am, this standard example, I am lost in the woods. It's cold. I'm hungry. I come across the cabin. Nobody home. Is it all right for me to break in and grab some food and warm myself? Violating property rights, and it's a really strict interpretation of the non-aggression principle would say, no, you just have to die. You just have to freeze to death or starve to death because you cannot violate their property rights. Or you could say, no, that's unreasonable. You break in. Well, then you might think, well, all right, so actually then you're really a consequentialist, not a non-aggression principalist. That's a word. But what I want to say is, well, exactly what the non-aggression principle applies requires of you is sensitive to context. So ordinarily it might require of you not breaking into the cabin. If you're just, you're walking along and you're not cold, you're not hungry, you just see a cabin and you think, hey, it'd be fun to check out this cabin. No, you don't get to break in. But in this case, what the non-aggression principle allows you might be something different. It might be that it allows you to break in so long as you later on, if you're able, to the extent that you're able, you compensate them. So the requirements can be flexible in that way. But it isn't just surrendering to consequentialism, because because the influence goes both ways. And as for whether this is just an epicycle, or this is a complicated tweak to the principle, and it'd be better just to drop it, as Matt says, I says, well, drop it in favor of what? I mean, the principle of non-aggression has nothing else that I know of really expresses so well this idea that we are not made for one another's uses, to put line from Locke, or not just objects, resources to be used by other people. So there's something valuable in the non-aggression principle. It needs to be interpreted in a nuanced way and not in a simplistic and ham-handed way. But that doesn't mean it's a reason that you should throw out the baby with bathwater.
One of the arguments you make in the post that I always thought was really fascinating, especially as someone who flirted with deontological views and consequentialist views, probably before reading a lot into Aristotelianism and Eudaimonism. And you kind of argue that deontologists and consequentialists are crypto eudaimonists because of what they're committed to in their arguments. Could you explain that?
Okay, so so you might think, well, a really hardcore deontologist would say, do what the deontology requires. Let justice be done, though the heavens fall. Do what deontology requires, even if the consequences would be absolutely disastrous. So, take an example in Doctor Strangelove, the movie Doctor Strangelove. There's this case where they have to get they there's this rogue general who's about to set off a nuclear war, and they have the code that will stop him, and they want to get this code to the president. So they want to call the White House. They have a payphone. There used to be these things called payphones. I'll explain to my younger viewers. Um, they don't have any change. The only way they can prevent a nuclear war that will destroy most of life on Earth is to break into the Coca-Cola vending machine. And the soldier there objects. Eventually he relents, but first he objects, saying, "You're going to have to answer to the Coca-Cola company." So a really strict deontologist might say, you should let all of the human race, or most of the human race, perish in nuclear war rather than break into the Coca-Cola machine. But hardly any deontologists want to say that. Deontologists usually want to argue that there's some way of interpreting that principle where you don't have to produce these horribly bad consequences. Likewise, a strict consequentialist might want to say, there's no limit to what horrors you might be able to inflict if it turns out that they would benefit people. So, like, if if 51% of the population would enjoy enslaving the other 49%, well, they outweigh them, and so if you're a utilitarian, you produce more benefit. Or if you're an egoist, well, I might enjoy enslaving you, and and if I enjoy it more than you would mind it, then I get to do it. But very few utilitarians want to say that. Or to take another standard example, suppose that I forget whether this comes from either Judith Thompson or Philippa Foot, but anyway, there are 5 patients. Each one needs a different organ transplant, and if you kill your one healthy patient and redistribute his organs, you could save 5 by killing one. Might seem like a utilitarian to be on board with that, but most utilitarians want to say no. They'll give some argument of how a general policy of doing that would be bad, and so on. So consequentialists usually try to show that they're not committed to uh, to do courses of action that deontologists would regard as horrific, and deontologists usually try to show that they're not committed to courses of action that consequentialists would regard as horrific. And so, what I take that to show is that each one really cares about the other one's concerns more than they officially should. So So Rothbard sometimes says, you know, after all, in addition to being a natural rights theorist, Rothbard was also a free market economist. And he has all these arguments about how free markets are great and will produce efficiency and prosperity for everyone and so forth. But he sometimes says when he's got his natural rights hats on, well, all that's just sort of a nice side effect, but it's not really relevant to the project of justifying the rights. The rights are justified even completely apart from the fact that they would have beneficial results. But he seems awfully concerned to show that they have beneficial results. And so, yeah, I think consequentialists always really care about the deontic stuff, or nearly always. And deontologists nearly always care about the consequentialist stuff. And I think that shows that really they, they recognize that both of these things matter. And I think that the reason they're reluctant to admit it is they think that if they recognize that, they really have to sort of go over to the other camp. But they don't have to. There's a third camp, and we're the nice camp.
I've I feel like maybe the reluctance is I don't know, the whole view about the unity of virtue and this kind of dialectical construction of the contents of the virtues is a lot messier and I think maybe it looks like trying to have your cake and eat it too, to some ethical theorizing. And it can also, maybe it runs the risk of, well, you can kind of devise sort of ad hoc, in this case the heavens, I'll let them fall, in this case, no, actually. And it just seems cleaner and easier to commit to one side of that.
Yeah, it is simpler, because the Aristotelian approach, and Aristotle was always very upfront about this. The Aristotelian approach does not, it's not like memorizing a list of rules that you can simply apply. Although people sometimes say that there are no ethical rules at all in Aristotle, and that's not true, because he does say, there are some things of which there is no mean, but any amount of it is wrong. So that's a rule. But he does think that you can't become a virtuous person just by memorizing a list of moral rules and following them. So the analogy again I like to give is, uh, learning how to ride a bicycle or drive a car or something like that. There are rules you can memorize. If you want to go fast on the bike, if you want to go faster, pedal faster. If you want to slow down, squeeze the brake things or backpedal in my day, because I had the old-fashioned bike. If you want to, turn the handlebar in the direction you want to go, you could. Those are rules that are pretty reliable, and you can memorize them. But you couldn't just memorize, if you've never ridden on a bike before, you couldn't just memorize all the list of all the rules for riding a bike and then jump on and ride off, because how do you avoid falling over? Well, you can't really describe it, or even if you could describe it, you could describe scientifically exactly what someone does. So when you're going, it's speed S, and you find yourself inclining at angle Y, then you shift your weight X degrees, etc. But that's not what you do. You get a feel for the situation. You learn through riding a bike how to do it. When you first time you do it, you fall over, or use training wheels until you don't need them anymore. So Aristotle thinks it's like that. It's you want there are some very precise guidance you can give, but if you just memorize all the things that involve precise guidance, it's not going to be enough. You have to get a feel. And again, it's like what Adam Smith says, that the rules for like, I don't think I completed the metaphor when I talked about it before. He said the rules for justice are like grammar, but the rules for the other virtues are like a good writing style. And
Yeah, you said that.
there are rules for a good writing style, but you can't just memorize those rules and run off and be a good writer. Um, for one thing, you need to read. You have to read a lot, and then you have to practice writing. And so the equivalent in virtue is you have to, you need models. as a kind of apprenticeship. Ideally, Aristotle thinks you have some actual person that you could learn from, but if not, you could have models that you don't actually personally interact with, but some kind of ethical models. And it's a matter of practice and training, and you develop an eye for seeing the thing to do. That just like when you're learning to ride a bike, you you get the feel for what to do in order to avoid falling over, but you can't describe it to someone. At least you can't describe it to someone well enough that if they've never done it, they could just memorize everything you said and jump on a bike for the first time and ride off. Um, so now someone may say, well, then this is non-rational. Well, Aristotle has a broad conception of rationality. For Aristotle, for example, thinks that our emotions belong to simultaneously to the rational and the non-rational parts of the soul. That's a way he disagrees with some other thinkers on that, because he thinks that the our people nowadays talk about like emotional intelligence. I think that he's on that track too. That he thinks emotions are cognitive; they're not just like raw feels. Um, they involve value judgments, and value judgments can be reasonable or unreasonable. They don't just automatically respond to our rational judgments, but they can be shaped by them. But they can inform them. Um, we if we train our emotional responses, they will give us. So, unlike, for example, Rand, Aristotle does think that emotions are tools of cognition. That a properly trained person can, their emotions will eventually respond to situations in such a way that will give them the right guidance. Um, but they may not be able to fully to articulate it. Rand thought that emotions could give us guidance, but we always have to be able to fully articulate whatever is the emotion is doing. We can always be able to unpack it. Although sometimes when Rand is talking about something like sense of life and so forth, she says, "Well, you can't fully articulate it." So even she has her, you know, you know, has her moments when she is, sort of what I would say is recognizing the Aristotelian insight. Um, so Aristotle thinks that reason and emotion have kind of complicated interaction. The moral virtues are about having the right emotional responses to things, but they're informed by, but they also inform what he calls practical wisdom. Well, he doesn't call it practical wisdom. Um, he has two different words for wisdom. It's not clear that they were really all that different in Greek before he got his hands on them. But one of them we translate as practical wisdom, the other we translate as theoretical wisdom. Practical wisdom is phronesis, which people have translated everything from prudence to intelligence, which is particularly, sorry, my dissertation advisor, but that was a particularly bad translation. Uh, but it's hard to, because because Aristotle wants to distinguish can be the kind of wisdom, just wisdom about the universe and understanding the cosmos and so forth, versus wisdom about what to do. And so understanding wisdom about understanding how the celestial spheres work or something is Sophia. Um, uh, Whereas understanding what is required for our action is phronesis. Um, and you could translate either of them as wisdom. Um, but if you translate them both as wisdom, it'll be confusing if you're translating Aristotle. But anyway, so this phronesis, this practical wisdom, you go see it it doesn't exist without the ethical virtues, and the ethical virtues don't exist without it. If you don't have practical wisdom, then you just have a bunch of emotional responses of various kinds, and some of them may sort of be more in tune than others, but without the cognitive component provided by practical wisdom, they don't count as ethical virtues. But if you just have some kind of intellectual understanding of something, unless it's hooked up in the right way with your emotional responses, it doesn't count as practical wisdom. So this is all like from stuff in book 5 of the Nicomachean Ethics. He talks about how these are hooked together. So in a way, the practical wisdom is like the cognitive side, and the ethical virtues are like the emotional side of the two things, and and our training our emotions gives us this kind of eye. So yeah, it is. Um, it's not straightforward, although really other ones aren't either. Because, for example, you might think, well, why not just be Kantian and you can apply the categorical imperative, and it's very simple, straightforward. Well, when Kant first presents it, it makes it seem simple, straightforward. But then there are passages, particularly if you go beyond like the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals to the actual metaphysics of morals, the work that the one everyone reads the one everyone reads, the groundwork or foundations, was actually a prequel to the one that fewer people read. And it turns out that for Kant, the application of these principles is nuanced and context dependent and so forth, and it does depend on developing a sense of judgment. So you don't really escape that by being a deontologist. And likewise, if you're a utilitarian, well, you have to have some kind of sense for um, even this not going to be quite the same way it works for Aristotle. If you're a utilitarian, you have to have uh, some kind of sense for what kinds of long-term concerns matter, as opposed to just what can I do in this particular situation that will produce the most utility, which might involve killing the five patients to save the killing the one patient to save the five. But if you have some sort of general concern about the kinds of things that John Stuart Mill had, because he was a nuanced and sophisticated utilitarian, in part because he was deeply influenced by Plato and Aristotle and those guys. He uh, he was reading Greek philosophy, you know, at the age that most of us have not yet learned to read anything. um, uh,
And that worked out great. End of that story.
yes, everything went well for Mill.
Um, so that's an interesting point about even the non-virtue views at some point will involve some kind of practical cultivation of a set of attitudes or emotional responses or judgments. Um, I so this piece that we're discussing and a lot of your work was sort of my throughway into this side of ethical theorizing and the ancient Greeks and all that stuff. And then, but beyond that, I really enjoyed how those ideas are fleshed out in another um, contemporary Eudaimonism, Julia Annis, who says a lot of things that you're saying. Specifically, a lot of her work is analogizing virtue to skills, like you said, driving a car, riding a bike,
Mm-hmm.
and how it's this more complex, um, cultivated thing. Do you like her stuff on virtue
Yeah,
as a skill, and do you generally?
yeah, and she has an interesting article on happiness as achievement, uh,
Mm-hmm.
where and she talks about receiving this I can't remember if she got it through email or snail mail, but anyway, she received some packet of information about happiness research in psychology, and she was invited to get involved in it because she was identified as a happiness researcher. And so she started reading what these happiness researchers in psychology were doing. And first of all, they were all assuming that happiness was some kind of subjective feeling. Um, and indeed, not even a very nuanced one. I mean, not like Mill. It was
Mm-hmm.
much more simplistic. And they had these formulas, like X amount of this in your life times Y amount of that equals your happiness score, and so forth. And so she just goes on a long rant about how this is wrong. So it's an enjoyable short read. She defends a more Aristotelian view.
She
You go
oh,
on.
go ahead.
No.
Well, she has a piece that I was just going to bring up as well on, so if virtue is a skill or something close to a skill, what is the opposite? What is the flip side of virtue? Vice. So she has a piece exploring how far the analogy can go with vice. If vice has same operates by the same logic, well, vice is a skill, uh, and you can't be vicious by reading a manual and being on and automatically being vicious either. And it's also this cultivated. Are you familiar with that, or what do you think of
I haven't
applying this
read those.
logic to the flip side? I
That's
should say.
interesting because you might think that if you think virtue is a skill, then vice is just going to be like incompetence, lacking a skill,
Right.
as opposed to have. But it's true that it depends on the kind of vice in question. There are vices just sort of you know involve sort of not rising to certain kinds of occasion that you might think are just lack of skill, but it's sort of like the seriously bad vices,
Yeah, like a
like
really vicious person probably became that way over time and sort of channeled the wrong impulses,
yeah, you
made
just
a
give
series of
someone
wrong
a copy of
decisions.
Mein Kampf, they don't become a Nazi overnight. Um,
Yeah,
and the
yeah,
example you often give is that when you have uh, you know the Nazi guards who were in charge of the mass executions uh, couldn't do it without massive quantities of alcohol to sustain them. Um, and in fact, at the death camps, one reason that they switched over to the gas chambers is that they did, as opposed to what they were originally doing, was just having the prisoners lined up and shot and in a ditch. Is that you needed lots of people, lots of guards to shoot them, and the guards found it very demoralizing. Whereas you
yeah,
only need one person to put the gas pellet in the thing. Um,
yeah, and it
and
anonymizes the whole thing in a way.
so these people were they were on board with an evil project, but they found it difficult. They were still human enough that they found it difficult to go through with it. Now there are always some who didn't find
Yeah,
it difficult.
yeah,
They had risen to that occasion.
yeah,
But a lot of people, you get involved in some, you know, you go somewhat partly down the path to evil, but it takes some work to get all the way down to the point where you just can massacre loads of people without feeling bad.
yeah. I mean, in a strange way, it connects to kind of something you brought up twice. One in the context of like, do you really count as happy if you're happy for 5 minutes? And then again, in the context of virtue, like do you really count as evil for 5 minutes, or like do you need to be like reliably capable of performing evil acts? And like even some of these most horrible people had an internalized, I guess, to that degree, and they had to anonymize the whole process with
Yeah, and
technology and machinery.
Aristotle distinguishes between um, people who do the right thing and don't feel strong temptation to do otherwise,
Hmm.
and people who do the right thing and do feel strong temptation to do otherwise,
Yeah,
and then people who are sort of completely committed to the wrong thing and don't feel any temptation to do the right thing, and sort of the different levels of morality there. People sometimes
yeah,
say that Aristotle's view is that a good person feels no temptation at all to do the wrong thing. I don't think that's actually right. I think his view is more nuanced than that. I think it depends because, for example, he thinks that he says that a courageous person will face the fears that they ought to face, but if they didn't feel any fear of the thing of the dangers that they ought to face, then he thinks they'd just be deranged. They'd be like those Celts. Even if it's a danger you ought to face, it's not like the Celts who face dangers they shouldn't face, like forest fires and earthquakes, allegedly. But but even if you're facing a danger you ought to face, we shouldn't feel such a debilitating fear that you're unable to face it. But you ought to feel some fear. You don't really have a proper grasp of the
yeah,
situation. And of course, if you are feeling
yeah.
some fear, then you are feeling some temptation. Go away. Then not to face it. Another example. This isn't from Aristotle, but a former student of mine at at North Carolina, Karen Storr, came up with this example, which I like, which is suppose you're someone who has the job of breaking bad news to someone, like you have to tell a military family that
Hmm.
their loved one is dead or whatever. So it's your duty to do that, but you shouldn't enjoy it that much. I mean, you ought to feel some reluctance to
Yeah,
do it. I mean, if it is your duty to do it, then you shouldn't feel so much reluctance you can't manage to do it. But there'd be something wrong with someone saying, "Yeah, I got three people today to inform that their loved one is dead. Boy, I love my job." There's be
yeah,
something wrong there. you
That's
are,
the
and so
wrong emotional response.
you're not responding to the full reality of the situation if you don't feel a certain kind of reluctance there to do it. So I and oh, that's not an example. Isn't from Aristotle. The courage one is, and so I think that consistent Aristotelianism doesn't say that you shouldn't feel any temptation to do the wrong thing, but it's true that
Yeah,
if you that you're not fully morally developed if you feel strong and persistent temptations. Now, of course, there is a school of thought that says that you don't count as virtuous unless you feel a temptation to do the wrong thing because you don't get credit for overcoming it. But of course, for Aristotle wanted to say, well, maybe you used to feel the temptation, but you overcame it, and so now you
yeah,
don't feel it anymore, but you still got the credit. And also, you want to say, well, you can ask. In fact, he does say somewhere that you can ask, even if you don't feel the temptation, we can ask whether if you did feel it, you would still do the right thing. And if you would, then
yeah.
you don't need the actual temptation in order to get the credit. Um, because there's this, yeah, I have another piece I've written, which is about temptation, because it's interesting that how often you see people say everyone thinks courage is about not having fear, but it's actually about having fear and overcoming it. And people are constantly saying this, and people are constantly agreeing with it. So everyone seems to agree that everyone thinks the wrong thing about courage, and so it's odd because everyone seems to think that the dominant view about courage is it's a matter of not having fear, but everyone seems to agree that that's wrong. Anyway, so I have a piece about that, but that's not for today. So we can talk about that some other time.
I've heard the point about breaking the news to a loved one about some passing or something bad before. I didn't realize that was a former student of yours that came up with that, because that's been on my mind for years, and I've often brought that up in conversation. It also illustrates too that again, that's a case where a successful life or a flourishing life will diverge um, from just merely feel goods and
Mm-hmm.
positive thoughts and feelings, because you shouldn't, that's not the right emotional response to having to break that negative news to a loved one, but again, like you said, something more regretful or somber. And the fear case too, I mean, that would be the stoic view, I assume, if no fear is, or maybe some version of the stoic view, that
Yeah,
emotional response is right, but that doesn't seem
yeah.
right,
Because
because
for
then you're
the
not
Stoics,
accurately ascertaining the situation.
yeah, since you shouldn't care about anything outside your control, and so therefore, fearing means you're judging that something outside your control is bad for you. You should not judge that. So,
Hmm.
uh, any emotion that involves a value judgment about something that's not completely inside our control uh, is going to. I mean, the Stoics are like Aristotle in thinking that the emotions are cognitive. It's that they think they're all
Hmm.
false, or all false except except just having a positive response to your own virtue.
Hmm.
They don't call that a passion. They call it, it's not a pathe, it's an eupatheia. But anyway, um, but uh, you know, if you love someone, they could be lost, and and that could hurt you. So you were valuing someone who could be lost, and that's bad. If you fear something, hope for something, anything like that, outside your control, and uh, and of course it can Stoicism can seem attractive, and a lot of people were very attracted to it. I mean, it was very popular, in Roman circles. It became kind of the pop psychology version of Stoicism. Of course, there's a pop psychology version of Stoicism that is sort of revived nowadays. Um,
Yeah.
uh, and it is a kind of liberation. You can see it as liberating, but on the other hand, it does require you to take, for example, a kind of creepy attitude toward other people. You can't really care about someone in the sense that that you would be hurt by their dying or they're being hurt or they're coming to hate you or whatever. Uh, there's a famous story that has attached itself to a bunch of different Stoics. I think it also attached itself to some non-Stoic people like Xenophon. Um, that someone's child dies and they come to tell the person, and the person takes it very calmly. And I said, "Why are you taking so calmly?" He says, "Oh well, I knew my kid was mortal. Um, you know,
Yeah.
seems wrong. I mean, the as the sentence put it, there's the slogan, don't sweat the small stuff, and then there's the further slogan of don't sweat the small stuff, and it's all small stuff. Well, Aristotle
Yeah.
did more to the first half, don't sweat the small stuff,
Yeah.
not all small
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
If a loved one dies, that you shouldn't just say, oh well, I've
Yeah.
obviously the kind of concern I have for that person shouldn't be such that I'll make you feel bad because they have died or been injured or or have turned against me or whatever. Um, uh,
Yeah, I don't
the
see why that emotional reaction to hearing your child died would be sounds remotely aspirational. Again, like you said, it's kind of liberating in a sense, but it doesn't seem like any liberation from what? From caring that about your child. So it doesn't seem aspirational to me.
well,
Um,
I am a rock. I am an island, and a rock feels no pain, and an island never cries. I mean, it can be attractive if you are
well, the karaoke
when
bit
you're
is later
feeling
in the
when you're
show.
feeling great pain and sorrow. It's tempting to wish you could turn it off.
Right, right.
Of
But then
course,
that's also a false promise that probably makes it last longer.
yeah. It says even if you could turn it off, and in fact, it's really difficult to turn it off. But even if you could turn it off, really, uh, there'd be something creepy about turning it off.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
It's not aspirational. It's
yeah,
corrupt. It seems corrupting
yeah.
to be
Actually,
that indifferent.
this is sort of a repeated theme in Star Trek with Spock and with Vulcans in general. The question
Oh
about
yeah,
is the Vulcans have a kind of stoic attitude. They want to
stoicism.
repress their emotions. Um, but Spock never fully succeeds. The fact that he is the master of his emotions largely does make us admire him. But the fact that he doesn't
Yeah,
fully succeed in squashing his emotions also makes us admire him.
yeah. And we're
He's
often
trying to
rooting
be a
for
stoic,
him.
and he ends up you know, being somewhere in the range between Stoic and Aristotelian, and then makes him more admirable than if he were just a pure Stoic.
Yeah,
Um,
we're often rooting for him to be more human or to indulge those human impulses that we see clearly has more often.
yeah.
I feel like when he
Yet on
does
the other hand, we
it's
don't.
for a moment.
We do admire him for the kind of mastery that he has.
Yeah,
It is that is attractive. We certainly don't want him to turn into Dr. McCoy.
sure. Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a huge appeal in that mastery, and I really love reading the Stoics, and I feel like I've taken a lot from them. I mean, kind of going back to what you said, Aristotle himself thinks that the worst, often more tempting mistake is to be subhuman or indulge in animalistic impulses. So if you're going to make a mistake, then at least go in the direction of the Stoics and the superhuman. I think most of the time.
And then Stoicism, it can be sort of an attractive strategy for like emergency situations, like James
Mm,
Stockdale, who people in my generation remember best for having been Ross Perot's running mate, although no one remembers that now. But uh, he had been a prisoner of war in Vietnam, and he was also a big fan of the Stoics and of Epictetus in particular. And uh, he has a he has an article or a pamphlet, which you can find online. It's called "Courage Under Fire," um, where he talks about how Epictetus's philosophy helped him get through being a prisoner of war, where he was
mhm,
constantly, tortured and abused and humiliated and so forth, and a kind of distancing from that situation, it was sort of saved his sanity. Um,
mhm.
and so, in a case like that, there could be something attractive about those virtues, but uh, you know, it's not the way to act in ordinary life, I think.
Yeah, you see similar things. I think people who were in concentration camps, I feel, and then wrote things afterwards. I feel like often express a similar kind of attitude. Absolutely. But then it also seems like in a lot of those cases, like you said, it kind of maybe keeps your sanity when you're in the dire situation, but after the fact, I'd
Yeah,
imagine
it's
maybe
gonna mess
there's
you
a
up.
process of Yeah, well, I was going to say I'd imagine there's a process of grieving, at least in
Mm.
some way, to then actually letting yourself at least acknowledge and process what happened to you and what you
Yeah.
experienced.
If you develop some kind of
Um,
emotional shell while you're going through that, then when you come out, well, either you keep
yeah,
the emotional shell and that's going to be wrong, or you peel it off, but the peeling it off is going to be painful as hell.
painful. Yeah, yeah. Well, emotional intelligence, like you said earlier, I think is a big factor in that. We've kind of gone off a tangent here on stoicism. Let me bring it back a little bit before we wrap up today's show. Um, because I wanted to ask, you have a lot in this post explaining this. I think the reason why you think this eudaimonism is a better grounding for non-aggression than the alternatives and avoids the pitfalls brought up by the other people in the debate at the time. A big reason you think that is this argument about the unity of virtue and how the virtues interdefine each other, and so that lets us avoid making either the mistake of treating the nap as like this acontextual abstract thing or as like this like merely defeasible rule of thumb. But I want to ask, this whole view of this dialectical construction of the content of the virtues is so it feels very theoretical and very like sophisticated, I guess, in a certain way. And I want to know how you think it relates to like everyday moral reasoning and our everyday moral intuitions and the way we actually think about ethics. And if it's, yeah, what do you think of that?
Well, I think it is a good model for how we ordinarily think about ethics, because the way we don't, it doesn't, it's not, we don't necessarily articulate all that structure. But I think
Right.
that people that we think of as virtuous do take these different kinds of things into account. The average person who's broadly speaking virtuous probably doesn't have a fully worked out theoretical philosophy of any particular kind, either deontological or consequentialist or whatever. But in practice, they do balance these things against each other. And Aristotle doesn't think that you first have to master all the details of his theory in order to start being moral. He thinks he can do it better, but he says you have to you know the he thinks that when you come to start learning moral philosophy, you already need some kind of leg up. If you are sort of completely morally clueless, you're not going to get anything out of reading the Nicomachean Ethics. You've already got to have some kind of grounding, and but most people do. Most people have some kind of sort of analogous to a distinction that Protagoras makes in Plato's dialogue of that name. Um, Even though Protagoras is sort of the opponent, the anti-Eudaimonist opponent, as Plato sees him. But uh,
Protagoras is the protagonist, antagonist.
yes, Antagoras. I wonder if there's any Antagoras, anyone named Antagoras. But anyway, um, so Protagoras draws this analogy between virtue and language, and he says, we are, there's a sense in which we're all experts in our native language, in a way in which we're not all experts in, carpentry or military strategy or these or medicine or these various other skills. It doesn't mean we're all equally skilled at it, but we all have the basic rudiments of linguistic communication in a way that we don't all have the basic rudiments of like surgery or something. Um, and Protagoras thinks that virtue is like that too, because he thinks human beings wouldn't be able to cooperate at all in society if they didn't have a basic level of virtue. Now Socrates rejects this, I think, partly because Socrates has sort of higher standards for what counts as virtue. He wants to know cooperate to do what, cooperate to live what kind of
Mm-hmm.
life. But still, I think there's something right about Protagoras, even if he's not completely right. Um, that so because one of the questions Socrates asks is how can you be in favor of be in favor of democracy and think that average people have enough virtue that you could have democracy. But on the other hand, put yourself forward as a teacher of virtue as though it were some specialized thing that only you have.
Mm.
I think Protagoras' answer is reasonable enough, which is, well, it's like language. Some people are better speakers or better writers than others, and you can apprentice yourself to them and learn how to do something better. But, you know, like learning learning how to speak your native language or write your native language better isn't like learning a foreign language where you're just starting at the ground level. Instead of learning how to do something you've already grasped. I think that Aristotle would say something like that about virtue as well, even if his theory of virtue would be quite different from Pythagoras's in its details. But he's going to say, look, uh, if developing this kind of eye for what to do in situations is something that you don't have to wait till you read the Nicomachean Ethics to start doing. You've already people already do it. Nearly everyone does it to different degrees and with different degrees of success, and you can learn to do it better. But you know, and he thinks that you will, if you read his book and understand it, you'll do it better. Or read his book, or take his lecture course, because I think these were really more like his lecture notes for his course. But you'll do it better after studying with him. But you're learning to do better something that he thinks people already do. Uh, he doesn't think that moral reasoning is something that where you have to have all his concepts in play are articulated explicitly. He thinks he's laying bare the structure of what we already, to some extent, recognize and care about. He's just trying to he's just trying to get us to do it better. So I don't. So I don't think that. I don't think that, for on an Aristotelian viewpoint, ordinary moral reasoning requires a whole bunch of theoretical apparatus. And for that matter, neither did Kant. I mean, Kant thought that he was simply making explicit the internal structure of the implicit structure of ethical commitment, so that we could do it better. But that again, he thought that he didn't think that nobody before him had ever managed to do any ethical reasoning properly. He thought that these concerns had always been driving them.
Mhm.
It's like good dinner. And I think Mill would say the same thing about his principle of utility. People who didn't recognize that they were utilitarians still, he thinks that they were always really, doing that.
I think one other major issue I just wanted to touch on. I'm curious why. So, reading this post and reading a lot of your work, you get the sense that uh, you see a kind of connection, or at least a complementary relationship between Aristotelian eudaimonism on the one hand and libertarianism, liberalism on the other, especially in, um, like as you said earlier, uh, when you were giving the Eudaimonist justification for the non-aggression principle on your view, the the centrality of reason and speech and discourse when dealing with others for Aristotle and for the Eudaimonist view, connection between that and Locke's view that we're not made for each other's purposes, or maybe Kant's that we're not mere means for others, and
Mm-hmm.
these more modern liberal libertarian views. So I have to ask, I feel like such a natural question then is why, if there's such a amenable connection there, why is there so few Aristotelian libertarians and people who combine and synthesize both the Eudaimonist and non-aggression view? Like earlier, we were talking about Julia Annis, and a lot of contemporary Eudaimonists are not libertarians, or don't believe in the non-aggression principle, and it doesn't even really seem on their radar, even to some extent. So, and I think there is that kind of complementary relationship. So I'm always befuddled why a lot of eudaimonists don't find it compelling, and why a lot of libertarians choose other groundings for the view.
I mean, there are a fair number of Aristotelian libertarians, but a high percentage of them came into it through Rand, and
Sure.
then
Including
gradually,
you.
learned, as did I, yeah, and then gradually, learn more about Aristotle and end up sort of with a more Aristotelian version of it than they did. So you got
Yeah.
from from you know Doug Rasmussen and Doug Denial, and um, did Ian Scoble come in through Rand?
I want to say so.
Yeah, I'm not as certain of that as I am with the Dougs, because
Yeah, I'm not either. But
um
obviously his views are in that realm.
yeah um
That's realm.
so and Rand actually had a big influence in academic Aristotelianism vigor that is often recognized, because a lot of people who work in Aristotle's philosophy, not just ethics, but metaphysics and epistemology and philosophy of biology and all these things, a lot of them came to it through Rand, and they don't, you know, they don't necessarily advertise that. But there is this view that there's a kind of uh, gulf between you know ancient and modern moral philosophy. There's a famous article by Elizabeth Anscombe, a theorist that I like in many ways, but she thought there was this big divide between ancient moral philosophy, um, which she's more a fan of, basically the whole tradition from Socrates through Aquinas, and then modern moral philosophy, both Kantian and utilitarian. Um, there's a widespread view, and of course, the Stoics are interesting because they really sort of the Stoics look like they're being as Kantian as you can be while being Aristotelian,
Proto-Kantian.
vice versa. But the Stoics are there's much less interest, despite the fact that there's a kind of a pop interest in them. They're always been much less popular than either Aristotle or Kant. So there's this view. There's a kind of this gulf between this idea that there's a shift from some kind of more old-fashioned view of human nature versus some modern, more stripped-down version, and so on. Although, if you look at sort of the way that liberalism emerges, there is a strong Aristotelian strand that goes into it, because you've got, I mean, in Locke, in his essays on the law of nature, cites Aristotle's function argument in the from Nicomachean Ethics. Of course, he gives it a theological twist that Aristotle doesn't, but he was certainly influenced by it. And then if you look at sort of some of the late scholastics, particularly the school of Salamanca, you people like Francisco de Vitoria, who were defending the rights of American Indians against and Native Americans against the Spanish conquistadors, or and the various thinkers who were defending sort of early free market economics, defending sort of anti-militarist views, defending sort of early quasi-democratic views, and so forth. Um, and they were taking Aristotelian ideas and pushing the direction of what looks like something like kind of classical liberalism, with the big exception for Protestantism. There's a limit to what we can tolerate, and that goes beyond it. Uh, but they were so uh, there has been this thread, but of influence. But yeah, there is this sense of a gulf between ancient and modern moral philosophy. I think a lot of people agreed with Anscombe about it. Another example would be Alistair MacIntyre in his book After Virtue, um, who he gives this broad narrative. It's a fascinating book, whether you agree with it or not, or partly agree and partly not. But this long narrative about how uh, the Aristotelian view required a certain kind of teleological conception of human nature, and as this became lost, then you get this sort of radically stripped down conception of human nature that's no longer able to sustain a virtue ethic, and so you get these um, what he thinks of as sort of you know things like utilitarianism and Kantianism, and he thinks as and liberalism in general, um, that he thinks as impoverished ethical and political views. Yeah. Anyway, so that's a widespread view, even though I think it's mistaken.
Well, I think this is a good time to close up this discussion. Um, yeah, I recommend everyone go check out the blog post yourself. We've gotten into it. There were a couple questions though in the post that weren't directly pertinent to eudaimonism and non-aggression that we didn't get into, like supererogatory ethical duties, and maybe in other episodes when that's more central. I think I'd love to explore that issue as well. That's also very
Yeah.
interesting stuff.
Also, we didn't get
So
into property rights, which I can
Oh
talk about
yeah,
some.
no, I mean, we have lots of stuff to go. I'm always, ear to the ground for our listeners and viewers. What pieces you want us to cover again, as we end this episode? You can send us stuff. Send me stuff on social media if you want us to talk about it on future episodes. I have some tentative ideas, but definitely open to hearing what people want to are curious about most in your work. So thanks everyone for listening. Thanks Roderick for chatting for an hour, almost 2 hours now. And catch us on the next episode, hopefully next month, about another piece by Roderick. So thanks everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Bye bye.